The other part was I don't know, I didn't like the culture around college applications. And I know this is something that you are kind of dealing with on your YouTube channel and everything, but I don't know, it didn't seem healthy to me to have all these 17-year-old kids who really should not be forced to choose the path for the rest of their life at that moment, I think. And they felt this immense pressure to kind of find their way to success at that age. And that didn't feel right for me.
Welcome, guys. Today I am joined by Zanny, Alexandra Merullo. Zanny graduated from Exeter, our high school, in 2016. And since then, she's done some really amazing things, traveled, worked a bunch. To get us started, Zanny, do you want to just introduce yourself real quick, like a 30-second intro? Who are you? Where are you from? What's your deal?
Yeah, so I'm Zanny. I actually just recently changed my last name to Steffgen. I got married in August. I'm from Massachusetts, went to Exeter for the last 2 years of high school. Yeah, I haven't gone to college. I've had a pretty unusual path since then. And right now I live in Telluride, Colorado, which is a little ski town in the mountains.
Yeah, why don't we rewind? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about high school Zanny. What was she like? And then, Exeter, I think a lot of people end up deciding to go to college, but what was going through your mind? Why did you decide not to apply?
Yeah, so I had a pretty unique perspective going into Exeter. When I was 14, I was a really hardworking middle schooler, and I had kind of an Exeter experience in middle school where I was in all these advanced classes and did all these extracurricular activities and varsity soccer, and I really burnt myself out. I woke up the summer before ninth grade one morning and I just couldn't get out of bed. For the next 2 years, I was really, really sick, and I missed out on the majority of ninth and 10th grade. Kind of spent those years on the couch. So going into Exeter, I knew what it felt like to burn out, and I knew I didn't want to do that again. And I also had a new appreciation for school after missing it for 2 years, and I'd kind of just been passed through the grades because I'd been far ahead, but there were significant gaps in my education. So when I got to Exeter, I was just like, yeah, I'm going to take it easy. I'm going to do what I enjoy, and I know that my education is kind of spotty and I won't be able to keep up in a lot, but that's okay. Came into Exeter really at peace with just taking it easy. And I had a really great experience. And because of those 2 years when I was kind of taken out of the normal flow of life, I knew that if I did that again, I would be okay. And I think that was a huge lesson for me. I ended up choosing to study abroad in Italy in 10th grade, where just the lifestyle was focused around joy, which is something that you don't find as much in America. Like my whole schedule was kind of built around these pleasures during the day. Like school would go from 8 o'clock until 1 o'clock. Then I would ride my bike home. It was a little beach town in Italy, and there would be this 3-course meal waiting for me. And that was just every high schooler in Italy. They would go to school until 1 o'clock and go home and have a 3-course meal. And there was just something so beautiful about that to me. So when I finished up my Exeter experience, my plan was to go to school in Italy, to go to university in one of those cities where a lot of my Italian friends were going. So that's partly why I didn't apply to college. The other part was I don't know, I didn't like the culture around college applications. And I know this is something that you are kind of dealing with on your YouTube channel and everything, but I don't know, it didn't seem healthy to me to have all these 17-year-old kids who really should not be forced to choose the path for the rest of their life at that moment, I think. And they felt this immense pressure to kind of find their way to success at that age. And that didn't feel right for me. I didn't know what my path would be, and I didn't like the college application process itself with all of the testing and the essay writing and the interviews and how much stress came along with that. And I was at a point in my life in high school where it's like, yeah, I've lived this unusual life already. I know what it feels like, and I really like it. And I know I'll be okay.
Yeah, so what have you been up to since, you went on a gap year? What did you do during this gap year?
Going into the gap year, I was really clear about the fact that I wanted the fall at home with my family. I kind of wanted to ground myself after the Exeter experience. I wanted to spend time with my family, and I wanted to get a job. that was kind of part of my thinking. So I moved home, and actually the first part of my gap year was really difficult and overwhelming. I think it's how a lot of people felt during COVID, where it's just like suddenly of all this free time and nothing to guide your schedule. And yeah, I felt really overwhelmed by that. I spent a lot of time just watching How I Met Your Mother on TV. Probably didn't shower too often, and I felt really overwhelmed, and I had a lot of trouble getting a job. When I did, I found a job hosting at a super busy wings restaurant near my house. So that kind of got me into the restaurant world. It was a crazy experience there. It was probably the busiest restaurant in all of New England. And we had a bunch of series of regulars who would come in through the door who were real characters. My favorite story from that time would be the bus fucker. So there was this young man who would come in, and he would always order the same thing. He would get a plate of 6 wings and a beer. And one of the other regulars, who always came in at 11 o'clock p.m. on the dot after his nursing shift, he one day kind of summoned me over. He's like, "Hey, do you see that guy at the end of the bar? We call him the bus fucker because he drives buses for UMass, and he was told not to stay too long at work because of his inappropriate contact with the vehicles." So every time that guy walked in the door, everyone would start whispering, "Bus fucker." So there were a bunch of just crazy characters in the restaurant, and I learned responsibility for the first time. I was promoted to a manager in the restaurant. I had to deal with customer service, which I think everyone should work in customer service because it's challenging in a lot of different ways, and it humbles you and it gives you empathy for everyone. I worked in that restaurant for about 6 months, and then I decided to go travel. Where I wanted to go first was Italy because that's what I knew the best, and I was a little nervous to travel by myself as a young woman, so I wanted to start off where I was comfortable, thinking I would eventually end up somewhere different. So I volunteered in an after-school program in the ghetto of Naples, Italy, which is a wild city. It is absolutely crazy. When I got off the ferry from, I think I was in Sardinia, when I got off the ferry in Naples, and my first interaction with a Neapolitan was a taxi driver. I was there with my family, and he asked my dad if he could buy me as his wife. So that was my first, and I was pretty upset. And then we went to our apartment, and the guy who showed us around, he showed us that there were something like 7 locks on the doors. There were 2 different sets of doors, and they all had all these locks. And I was like, holy shit, what did I get myself into? Because Naples is crazy. It is known for the mafia presence there is pretty large, and the city is dirty. Everywhere I walked, there were massive human shits on the ground. Yeah, it's dirty, it's grimy, but it's also the most spirited place I've ever been. In Naples, if you ask somebody for directions, they won't just tell you where to go, they'll take you there themselves, even if it's completely out of their way. So I spent about a month there by myself. I joined this really cool crew of international volunteers. So we would volunteer by day, and at night we would go stand in the piazzas and drink beers, and that's just kind of how the nightlife was in Naples. It was like all packed into the center of the piazzas, everyone standing up, drinking beers and talking. When my time at the volunteer place ended, I really didn't know where to go from there, so I followed 2 of my friends from the volunteer experience to Florence, which is a city I have been to before. It's not my favorite in Italy, especially after how wild Naples was. Getting off the train in Florence, it was eerily quiet and eerily clean. So I had some fun there, did some kind of touristy things, which embarrassed me, like taking a Vespa wine tour, which is the most touristy thing I've ever done, but it was also awesome. From there, I ended up going back to where I had studied abroad. And this other crazy story is, so when I studied abroad in Italy in 10th grade. I had a boyfriend there for a couple of years after. So even during my time at Exeter, on summer breaks and Christmas breaks, if I could somehow save the money for it, I would go visit my boyfriend in Italy. And on one of these trips, I was waiting in line to get on the plane in Boston. And I was talking on the phone to someone in Italian. And I got off the phone, and this young guy turned around and and started speaking Italian with me. And it turns out that he was flying back to Italy from studying abroad in Massachusetts. We decided to sit next to each other on the plane, and we spent the entire 6-hour plane ride talking about our experiences studying abroad, the difference between the two cultures. He was also an aspiring Italian rapper, so he went through his whole catalog of songs with me, and that was cool. We did some freestyle Italian rap on the plane. Yeah, I thought I would never see him again, but a couple years later, I ran into him in Italy and spent a night kind of going to dinner, talking, and we just had this huge connection because we'd met each other at that point in our lives when we were exploring these two cultures. So I decided to go visit him, and I no longer had the Italian boyfriend. So I thought that this Italian rapper guy was going to be the love of my life. And so I went and visited him in Italy, got super, super drunk with him and his friends. And I woke up the next morning and I had booked a flight to Berlin with him. And I did not remember this, but I saw it taken out of my bank account and in my email. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to surrender to this adventure because that's what the year is about. I kind of gave myself permission to just go along with whatever came my way. So I ended up going to Berlin with this Italian rapper I met on a plane and his best friends from high school. So it was me and these 4 Italian guys wandering the streets of Berlin. And those of you watching this who knew me at Exeter know that I was goody two-shoes, never did anything wrong, tried not to break any rules. I had thought for the longest time that I was very much against drugs and alcohol and partying, but in Berlin, I let myself explore that part of life as well. So I went to clubs for like 48 hours straight, which you can do only in Berlin, 11 o'clock in the morning, just showing up in the same clothes from last night, the door of another club. And yeah, it's very hard to get into the clubs in Berlin. So we had a lot of fun, me and these 4 Italian guys, trying to figure out exactly what they were looking for in their club guests and then trying to adhere to that, whether it was like speaking German, speaking Italian or English. So yeah, I just let myself have fun there, but I kind of went a little too far in Berlin and I felt like, okay, now I know the limits of partying, and that's kind of a valuable lesson. From there, I felt like, okay, I really need to switch gears right now and do something a little bit better for myself, a little bit healthier. I'd just been drinking pretty much every day of my travels. So I booked a week at a Buddhist retreat center in Ireland. I found it because my father had been on a similar retreat at their kind of sister retreat center in France, and he recommended that. So then I flew to Ireland and I spent a week in the city of Cork, which is a cool, funky little city. I stayed in this kind of gritty hostel. A lot of the hostels I stayed in were very gritty. I was kind of jammed into a room with 4 or 5 guys, tiny little corner of this hostel, tiny little bathroom, no like dedicated shower area. So you kind of showered over the toilet. Yeah, I just spent a week in Ireland. I was also taking a lot of hikes because I knew I wanted to walk the Camino del Santiago, which is a pilgrimage in Spain. And I felt like I needed to kind of get in shape for that. So I spent a lot of time walking. Had another fun moment there where I met these French guys at the hostel. We had a lot of fun sitting around and talking late at night, and their English was terrible. And so the next day I woke up after another night of going out to listen to live music with a bunch of cool people at the hostel. I was pretty hungover and I just wanted to be by myself and go for a hike. So I went to the bus station, and then the 2 French guys walked in. They asked where I was going, and I told them that I wanted to go on a hike by myself, and they thought that I was inviting them. So they purchased tickets and came with me, which ended up being great. It was a lot of fun, but there was definitely a miscommunication there. That was pretty funny. Yeah, so in Ireland, I spent about a week in that city, and then I went to the Buddhist retreat center. And just for a week, I stayed in a hostel there, went to daily meditations, tried to totally cut out any phone usage, social media. I read a lot of books, so I picked up the Bhagavad Gita, which is now kind of an integral part of my spiritual understanding. So that was pretty cool. So I was at this retreat center. It was on a donkey sanctuary, which I didn't know was a thing. So a lot of my walks there included walking past all of these donkeys, just grazing in the fields. Ireland is really beautiful. I mean, the weather was far from ideal, but it's just gorgeous. And The retreat center, the meditation room was right over the cliffs. So it looked like the cliffs were right beneath us, windows all around, and this gorgeous sea, lots of greens and yellows there. I just remember the color scheme of Ireland sticks out to me. Also remember that was the first time that I hitchhiked, which was something growing up in America was kind of taboo and a little scary, but that was the only way to get from the retreat center to the grocery store. So I had to hitchhike. I walked one way and hitchhiked back. And I was not murdered, contrary to what I thought might happen. Friendliness of the Irish people also really stood out to me. I had a bus driver who I asked him how to get to a certain hiking trail, and he just drove me right to that trail, even though it was a little bit off the route, and told me he'd pick me up in a few hours on the way back. And on that hike, another gorgeous solo hike, I ended up running into this massive wildfire. Came up on a hillside totally alone in the middle of the countryside, and it was just being devoured by flames. So I had to run away and call the fire department at the same time. And they were very unimpressed because someone had already reported it, but felt like that was my duty. So I just had all of these experiences in Ireland that they just showed me another facet of life and the way that people can be. And I met a lot of people in the hostels and the retreat center who were living really unconventional lives. There was a girl at the retreat center, a young German woman who had decided not to go to school like me. And she had worked as a nanny, then had worked for the nannying agency, then had found her way to the retreat center and discovered Buddhism. And just hearing these stories of, what can happen in your life when you take away all of these restrictions and this narrow-minded path forward, that so many people feel really pressured to participate in this certain path. And I think that works for a lot of people, but just for me, having an example of people who had said, hey, that's not for me, I want to do something different, that was huge. From Ireland, I did walk the Camino del Santiago, which was an incredible experience. And it was great that that came at kind of the end of my gap year travels, because it gave me the chance to reflect on everything that had happened before. Wake up before the sunrise and walk maybe 8 or 9 hours through the mountains, through these tiny little Spanish villages. My best friend from home joined me for a good part of that. For the beginning, I kind of found this little family of people who I stayed at all the hostels with and spent all my meals with. A young Canadian woman who remains one of my best friends in the whole world after that experience. And yeah, I had the chance to kind of inspect my mind while I was hiking, if that makes sense. For 9 hours a day, I was there with no distractions, no TV. I deleted all social media. It was just me and nature and this trek. And I had the chance to kind of watch my mental patterns. I could see my moods coming and going, and I had the realization along the trail that my moods are constantly changing. That's just being a human being means that your moods and your thoughts are constantly changing. I don't know, there was a relief in knowing that, I don't have to be attached to every mood because it's just gonna pass and another one's gonna come along. Yeah, so I had a lot of time to process things, to kind of face some of the things the questions that I developed over the gap year, and kind of see where I wanted to go from there. Long answer to your question, but that was my gap year.
Yeah, just, did a few things here and there. I like the term you used, surrender to adventure. It sounds like, when you started your gap year, this wasn't exactly planned itinerary. I was wondering in your gap year, you mentioned traveling alone. Was there any point where you felt kind of unsafe, or you wanted to be alone or things like that?
I never really felt unsafe, I have to say. I think part of that was it kind of developed street smarts. Yeah, I'd been pickpocketed before on travels, and I kind of knew a few things, and I surrounded myself with people I trusted. That was huge. And there was a lot of that time that I spent completely alone, and I definitely craved my own company. And I think that's an important thing too, just to be a young person and be all right with being on your own. That was huge for me.
I'm kind of absorbing all of this information. Zanny, did you wonder, did you want to go to college at any point? Or were you thinking is this for me? Or by the end of the gap year, were you more convinced that you were now I'm more sure?
I did want to go to college. I think part of that was I just didn't know what else to do. as a young woman with no real marketable skills or anything like that. I just didn't know what else there was for me. So when I came back from the gap year, I did try to apply to college in Italy. I was sure about that. I liked the European system. I wanted to live abroad. I knew that. Yeah, so I applied to college in Italy, and they said it was too late to get a visa. So I did some research and I discovered the University of Malta, which was the only university in Europe that it seemed to be good quality of education. The classes were in English and it had kind of a late application deadline. So I applied there, but a few weeks before I was supposed to go to Malta, they contacted me and said that since my credits from high school didn't really match up with what their requirements were, I would need to take a remedial English class in order to go to school there. Needed to take actually a whole year of English reading and writing along with the other classes that I had missed. And I thought about it and I was like, there's no way I'm going to take a class in my native language. That doesn't sound right. So I let that opportunity go too. And at that point, it was kind of like, okay, it's too late to apply to college in the US. There's always, I'm intellectually very curious. So I knew that I would always find ways to learn, to read, to research. But part of it, I think, was I didn't really know exactly what I'd want to study. I have a lot of interests, but nothing that I feel like could become a career with studying. A lot of my interests now are writing and creative stuff and language translation. I just didn't feel like a college degree was going to help me with those passions. So I felt kind of at peace with not going to school. There are definitely times now when I think, okay, yeah, maybe I would go back to school at some point just because I'm curious and I have all these questions about things, but.
Gotcha. Well, okay, so this was just the gap year, but you've done other stuff too since the gap year. You continued traveling and doing cool stuff. I know for a fact that you were in Cambodia running a hostel at one point. I don't know when exactly that was, but yeah, please continue with your adventures. I just want to sit here and listen.
All right. After I got that denial from the college in Italy and the University of Malta wasn't working out, I kind of fell into a little bit of a depression because I'd had all of these wonderful experiences that had just totally opened my world and perspective on my gap year. And then I was back at home, back at square one in the same exact place that I had left. I was with my family who didn't really see they didn't understand all these changes that had happened. So they still treated me like this 18-year-old I was when I left, but I felt so different. I went back to work at that same restaurant. I became a server and then a bartender, kind of learned those skills. And I fell into a pattern of life there, but I just felt like there was something missing. I didn't want to stay in Western Massachusetts. That's never a place that's really felt like home. I decided that I was going to travel to a Buddhist country because I had this interest in Buddhism and I wanted to live in a place where that was really part of the lifestyle. So I decided to go to Southeast Asia and I looked into some opportunities. I'd met a lot of people in hostels in Europe who they were doing this kind of work trade where they would work and then they'd stay there for free, get free meals. And that seemed like because I was funding the trip by myself with the money I made from waitressing. So I felt like that would be a good idea financially. So I started to look into those opportunities. I narrowed it down to a couple different places in Indonesia, Thailand, and Cambodia. And I was really not sure which direction I wanted to go. So I went to visit my friend in Canada who I had met on the Camino. This is pretty crazy. It shows that it was meant to be. So when I had met her, I asked her her favorite place that she'd ever been, and she told me Cambodia. And she had told me how spiritual a place Angkor Wat was and how special it was to be there. So that was kind of stuck in my head, and I wanted to talk to her and ask her about Cambodia. So I visited her. One day, she and her boyfriend were looking for an apartment. They wanted to move in together. So they were apartment hunting, and I came along to this apartment they were looking at. We walked in and my friend and her boyfriend kind of started walking around and checking out all the different amenities. And I saw that the former owner of the apartment had a backpack and hiking boots. And so I asked him, hey, where are you going? And he said, oh, I'm leaving for Cambodia in a few weeks. He said the date of his flight was January 18th, which was the exact day that I had been looking into to fly to Cambodia, if that's what I wanted to. So I felt like, okay, that seems like a sign to me. So I took it as a sign, and that night I booked my flight for January 18th, and I made the plans to meet up with that guy from the apartment. My Canadian friend and her boyfriend ended up moving into that apartment, and I did end up meeting up with that guy in Cambodia when he came through. That's how I ended up in Cambodia. I signed up to bartend at a hostel called Tipsy Turtles, and it's in the town of Siem Reap, which is where Angkor Wat is. For most of my life, any travels I'd taken had been to Europe, and that's, Europe is as similar to America as it is different in a lot of ways, culturally and just architecturally and everything. So that was my first glimpse of a totally different world. And I remember getting off the plane, getting in a tuk-tuk to go to the hostel, and I just started crying because it was incredible. The scenes that I saw, like a monk walking barefoot under an umbrella wearing orange robes. I'd never seen, monks out in public before in the US, or a whole family of 5 on the back of a scooter, or a cow walking down the city street. It was just so different to me. So I arrived at Tipsy Turtles and I met the owner who had hired me, whose name is Philip. He is now my husband. The first thing he said to me is, want to check out the town? And I got on the back of his motorbike and yeah. And I just remember, like, he took me to a market, and it was just another culture shock for me. Like, we rode the motorbike through the market, and I have never seen an Asian market before at that point, and it was just such a different world. Like, all of these women in the floral Khmer pajamas, that's kind of an outfit that a lot of them wear, and there was a lady who was a butcher hacking away at just pieces of a cow on the ground in this market, and just the smells and the sounds and all of the street food, it was just incredible for me. And Philip was the one who kind of brought me to that experience. And so, yeah, I was immediately interested in him. Was only supposed to be in Cambodia for a month, volunteering in this hostel. Then my plan was to kind of go to Eastern Europe and do the same thing there, and then go back home. And I didn't really know what I was going to do from there. But I fell absolutely in love with Cambodia, and it had nothing to do with Philip. It was just the culture, the people, the locals. There was this amazing expat community of people from every corner of the earth who had come and chosen to live in Cambodia. And they shared, a love and appreciation for the culture and the people and the food and the language, but also they had these kind of worldly views. So we would sit around. My friends were from Argentina, Bosnia, Australia, US, England, South Africa. I'm probably forgetting some countries, but we would just talk late into the night about different policies in our countries, or how to solve the problem of poverty. Like, we would just be discussing these huge things with all of our different backgrounds. And there was something absolutely addictive to me about that. So I extended my stay for 3 months. I ended up living there for almost 2 years. So that was a big chunk of my experience since high school.
And what led you back to the States? Because now you're in Colorado, right?
I got really sick in Cambodia. I have cystic fibrosis, so I get a lot of sinus infections, lung infections. There was one point in Cambodia where I had a really challenging schedule. So it's really hard to make enough money to get by in Cambodia. And I kind of willingly subjected myself to living like a local. So I taught English from like 8 o'clock in the morning until noon. And it's still amazing to me that they would let a 20-year-old woman with no college degree or TEFL teach English. But that's just how it worked there. And yeah, from there I would go and work in a restaurant at night. And I did that 6 days a week, both jobs. And it was really intense. And I barely made enough money to pay my rent and afford food. So there was a lot of pressure and stress involved with that. So there was one night after that day when I just felt like I needed a break, and I asked my favorite tuk-tuk driver and friend to bring me somewhere beautiful. And he brought me out on this country road to a flooded rice paddy, and it was gorgeous. It was a double rainbow, and this flooded rice paddy, only locals were there, hanging in hammocks, looking out at the water. And I decided to go swimming. And I came out of the water and I noticed that my clothes were now stained brown. A few days later, got a really bad sinus infection, and I discovered that it was E. coli, which I'm assuming I got from swimming in flooded rice paddy. Yeah, it took about a year of a lot of IV antibiotics. I had to go to Bangkok to see a doctor, and I got really sick, and my family finally said to me, like, I was wasting away. I was very thin. I had to quit my jobs. I was really, really unhealthy, and my family said, it's time for you to come home. We want you to take care of your health. I had to leave Cambodia, and it was the most heartbreaking thing that has ever happened. And I still am mourning that loss. But Philip ended up selling Tipsy Turtles to come with me. And we went to Germany for a while, and we looked into places where we could go work in the US, where I would have access to healthcare, but where we could make and save money and be somewhere beautiful and interesting. And he applied to so many places for a visa, and the only one that accepted him was this town of Telluride. So that's how we eventually ended up here.
Gotcha. Wow. Okay. Those were a lot of stories, Annie. Those were some
yeah.
really
Hey, you asked for stories.
I did ask for stories. I made a special request for stories, and Zanny delivered. Well, we're almost out of time. I have a student in the waiting room because I'm gonna tutor after this, but I do have 2 more questions.
Okay.
My first question is about spirituality. You mentioned the Buddhist retreat in Ireland. Was that like your first exposure? I'm sure it was like a major formative experience, but I'm also just curious as to how your perspective about that has evolved over the years, or how has that affected your way of life?
Yeah, so actually my dad is a practicing Buddhist, and he's an author. A lot of his books are about Buddhism. So growing up, he had always talked to me about that, taught me to meditate from a young age. Gave me a lot of books to read on it. So it was always a part of my life. I had done a lot of like Buddhist meetings. I'd tried different kinds of Buddhism, like chanting. When I moved to Cambodia, I kind of saw it in practice. And yeah, I try to meditate. I do a lot of reading on different religious traditions. I like to go to all kinds of religious celebrations. So for me, I like to kind of experience all of that, because I think it's all talking about the same kinds of things, just in different interpretations. So
all right, my last question is, I'm being mindful of time. It's the one I sent you, which is, if you could go back in time and give high school Zanny 2 pieces of advice, what would you tell her?
I would tell her to trust her gut, because I think that's something I did, but I was always doubting that. From where I am now and all these experiences I've had because of those unconventional decisions I made back then, I would definitely just reinforce that, like, it's okay, you're doing the right thing. And then I would actually ask her for advice, because I feel like she kind of knew what to do a little more than I do now.
Been on so many adventures. That's something that I've always wanted to do, is travel a lot. Hero and I have talked about like living in different countries for 3 to 6 months each time, and hitting up like 10 or 20 different countries. It's like on my bucket list before I die. And I'm thinking back to some of the other kids in our grade who have had gap year experiences too. Hero, and I talked to Arya Burke, and he mentioned, it's kind of like, I've noticed a theme, which is like, you come back from the gap year and you guys are like, things are kind of like down. So yeah. I'm getting a lot of questions on the channel about gap years, how to gap year a plan. Just noticed that. I found that a lot of people went on these amazing adventures, and it is kind of one of those moods that passes to like naturally after you have a more of like a euphoric, bit of a soul-searching spiritual experience, and you learn more about your identity, and that return to mundanity can be like not so exciting. But anyways, Zanny, thank you so much for sharing your experience. I think that a lot of high schoolers and young people need to hear this. There's a pressure for all of us to go to college. It's like a track that society sets. And like Zanny said, like, sure, sometimes structure can be very good, but it's not for everyone. It's and sometimes it's just not the right time. Keep an open mind, guys. And also, college is super expensive in America, so it's another thing to consider. At any rate, I just think there's a lot of value in listening and reflecting on the stories and the advice that Zanny has given us. And just wanted to say a huge thank you again for being willing to share.
Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate that you're doing this.
If you guys have any questions, maybe you can leave them in the comment section, and I'll bother Zanny and see if she can respond to them if there's any burning questions that you guys have. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will catch you guys next time. Bye.